Red Bull says it desperately needs Sergio Perez in the fight at the front in F1 again, but that's not happening, and that could lead to drastic action. Yet another race weekend has passed with Max Verstappen left solo against increasing opposition, as this time he duked it out at the British Grand Prix with 2 McLarens and 2 Mercedes. And where was Perez? 2 laps down in the race after a failed strategy gamble from a pit lane start off the back of spinning into the gravel in damp conditions in qualifying. Perez is on a turgid run of form, and you might think he's lucky that he only recently signed a new Red Bull contract that technically ties him to the team until the end of 2026. But in reality, he's still vulnerable to Red Bull ruthlessly chopping him, and as his struggles have continued, the idea of doing that through performance clauses is being taken seriously. The announcement of Verstappen and Perez together again at Red Bull for, in theory, the next 2 seasons indicated that Red Bull's only remaining driver choice was Daniel Ricciardo or Liam Lawson for its second team RB. But now Lawson's preparing for a 2024 Red Bull test in the form of a promotional event at Silverstone this week, which will help Red Bull evaluate his suitability for the top team. At the same time, Perez is running out of races to improve things by the summer break. The long shot prospect of Perez getting dropped by Red Bull first emerged when Red Bull Motorsport advisor Helmut Marko said RB needed to get back to serving a purpose as a training ground for Red Bull Racing as it was in its Toro Rosso days. This was primarily interpreted as a hurry up for Ricciardo, or else he gets dumped for Lawson. But the 1+1 deal Perez has inevitably includes multiple clauses, and we understand he could be in the firing line as early as the summer break. While nobody at Red Bull's gone on record to say emphatically Perez needs to sort this out or lose his seat, they haven't exactly jumped to opportunities to deny that, and Red Bull is turning up the pressure. Verstappen's been left fighting single-handedly at the front as Red Bull's faced an increased threat from McLaren and Mercedes, and more sporadically Ferrari. That's rammed home the point that Red Bull doesn't have a car advantage that can carry an underperforming second driver. Perez is contributing so little he's actually scoring points at the same rate as Haas driver Nico Hülkenberg and Aston Martin's Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso, and has left Red Bull outscored by McLaren and Mercedes over the last 6 races. Team boss Christian Horner said Perez's woeful points return is not sustainable and that Red Bull desperately needs both its drivers in the lead fight, so Verstappen has some backup. If Perez doesn't prove he can rise to that challenge before the summer break and either Lawson or Ricciardo convinces Horner to take a punt, there really could be a driver change at F1's best team this year, not just for 2025. Most Red Bull drivers are on multi-year deals that are almost like rolling one-race contracts, given the threat of being dropped exists for almost all of them. Only Verstappen has true job security. The reality of life in this team demands a level of performance that Perez has not lived up to, and that's making his new 2-year deal look like a big mistake. But it would be wrong to say he's been struggling since his new contract was announced after the Monaco Grand Prix, because his slump was already 2 races old by then. As of Miami, which was not a stunning Perez race but was the last time he finished in the top 5 and conveniently splits the season so far neatly into 2 halves, Perez was second in the championship, 33 points behind Verstappen. In the 6 races since, Perez has scored a best result of 7th and scored just 15 points, falling to 6th in the championship in the process and leaving him 137 points adrift of Verstappen. That is significant given it's been suggested one of the clauses in Perez's contract is Red Bull can void it if he's 100 points behind Verstappen at the summer break. The only good news for Red Bull in this run is that Ferrari, its closest championship rival, has stuttered in form. That's protected it from coming under massive pressure as McLaren and Mercedes, which had slower starts to the season, have outscored Red Bull in recent races. But there's a long way to go in this season, and at this rate there will be a serious Constructors' Championship fight. Given the noise around Perez's situation was amplified at Silverstone, yet another setback there was really badly timed. Verstappen actually had some sympathy for the qualifying mistake that ruined Perez's British Grand Prix weekend, having had his own near miss at the same corner when everybody switched to slicks on a drying track in Q1. But however hard the conditions were, Perez was the only one to beach it. And though Verstappen's own error came back to hurt him in qualifying as he did serious damage to his floor, he still managed to start 4th and fought for the win on race day. That's the kind of bad day at the office a team like Red Bull needs from its drivers, and even Perez has now admitted that the last 2 races before the break are important for him to turn things around. If Red Bull really is rethinking its long-term driver plan, then the obvious candidate would be out-of-contract Carlos Sainz for 2025, given he's been hesitant to decide between underwhelming options like Alpine, Williams and Audi-owned Sauber. While this wouldn't solve Red Bull's driver problem in the short term, it would give Verstappen a more competitive teammate next year and beyond. But Red Bull doesn't seem to want to pair Verstappen with Sainz. The two were teammates at Toro Rosso as F1 rookies, and as is widely known, the presence of their fathers created significant tension within that team. So Sainz appears to be a no-go. We won't rule out that changing given how volatile the driver market's been this year, but it doesn't seem to be on the cards at the moment. If Perez gets dropped then, it potentially solves the other Red Bull driver problem that has emerged: how to choose between Ricciardo and Lawson for the RB alongside Yuki Tsunoda, because Lawson's in the frame to go immediately into Red Bull Racing. Having stood in for Ricciardo for 5 races last year and done well, Lawson's been aching for a proper F1 chance. And Red Bull needs to decide by September whether it's putting him in one of its cars or not for 2025, or else he becomes a free agent. The easy solution would be to put him at RB full time, but there might be a gap higher up the food chain to fill, and sooner rather than later. If Perez continues to disappoint, then Lawson needs to grab the opportunities ahead of him. His test in the RB20 this week comes in addition to a pre-planned 2022 AlphaTauri test at the end of July. Horner's tried to play down the RB20 run, but he did not rule out shuffling the lineup when asked. He just acknowledged that Perez is under pressure, as that's normal in F1 and it only mounts when the driver is under-delivering. It's timely for Red Bull then to get some fresh data on Lawson to evaluate the 22-year-old in its current car and judge his potential against how Perez and Ricciardo are performing in F1. Even if Lawson's not quite worth the punt at Red Bull Racing, a Perez exit could solve its driver dilemma another way if Ricciardo ends up promoted instead and Lawson replaces him at RB. That the current second team drivers aren't automatically in the mix for a potential Red Bull Racing vacancy reflects the oddness of Red Bull's driver situation. The door seemed to have closed fully on Ricciardo after a poor start to 2024 alongside Tsunoda. And Tsunoda is quite clearly not thought of highly enough by the Red Bull hierarchy to merit a Red Bull Racing chance of his own. A reason's never really been given for this, despite Tsunoda impressing so much for RB over the last 12 months or so with the kind of performances that would usually merit a promotion from the junior team. That points to off-track factors being a consideration, and in Tsunoda's case, whether it's justified or not, there are question marks inside Red Bull about his attitude, approach and how he would handle being Verstappen's teammate. In theory, this leaves the door open for Ricciardo to position himself as Perez's successor. The problem there is that his overall season form so far doesn't really justify it. Recently, Ricciardo has been stronger. He'd beaten Tsunoda 3 races in a row and scored points twice in that run, heading into Silverstone. But then Tsunoda finished 10th at the British Grand Prix, while Ricciardo had a difficult weekend and was just a bit off Tsunoda all the time. So Ricciardo's probably not hitting the marks he needs to for Red Bull to take him super seriously, but if it's desperate for a Perez upgrade, it might not need much convincing. That's why, as we understand it, Ricciardo's been told to up his game by the break, the same timeline that Perez is working with. Ricciardo said F1's becoming more Hollywood with the wild narratives around it in recent years, but that he has no proof he'll be anywhere else in the second half of this year and is not in a place to say that or think that or predict that, so he wouldn't make any suggestions about what happens next in the driver market. But Ricciardo did concede that crazy things can happen in F1, and Red Bull's hand being forced into a shock mid-year change at its top team would be one of the most extraordinary twists in recent memory. By the summer break, Red Bull will have a more complete sample set of data, not only how much Perez is struggling and how far behind Verstappen he is in terms of points, but whether Lawson or Ricciardo are any more convincing as alternatives. Perez's fate should be in his own hands for now. If he turns things around, then all is well. But despite his defiant stance at Silverstone that this is exactly what's about to happen, there's not really any evidence to back that up. As we said earlier, Perez's form had already downturned at the time his new deal was announced, which is why it surprised so many, despite Horner claiming it made absolute sense at that point in time. Horner's joked that we thought the contract would help, but there's been no arresting the nosedive. Perez seemed to be clinging to his practice pace on Friday at Silverstone when he was quicker than Verstappen in FP2 and argued that he's making good progress and just about to unlock a couple of temps. But doing it in Silverstone FP2 is one thing, especially when Verstappen didn't complete a run on a second set of tyres like Perez did, and doing it when it matters is another. Perez is absolutely right that this kind of step will make life very different for him and push him back closer to the level he was at earlier in 2024. But it's quite strange to hear a driver say they are just about to unlock a couple of temps, given it's hypothetical. It's also quite a nonchalant attitude to a performance deficit that's having such big consequences for driver and team. It might accurately reflect Perez's confidence, but it doesn't reflect reality, and Perez needs whatever promise he is seeing behind the scenes to translate into something tangible and fast. He's downplaying the talk about his future, insisted he's fully committed to the team and fully committed to my career, and said, I have a contract with the team and I will turn things around. The problem for Perez is that his commitment to Red Bull is not really the issue. It's whether Red Bull's willing to stick with him.